A very warm welcome. As you can see, we have Mr. Aurélien Cottet. He's the MaaS expert and advisor. We're going to discuss, can MaaS be an accelerator for acceptance of autonomous vehicles? These two topics, MaaS and autonomous vehicles, have been discussed, seen, promoted as silver bullets. We need to discuss that, and I think it's time to discuss it. What you see there are autonomous vehicles. Two things that may really like sound strange. The one to the right, courtesy of Yamaha and the village of Kamikoani in Japan, is an autonomous vehicle being driven in the middle of the snow. It looks like a golf cart, but as some of you who may be experts, they do see that it has some sensors. It is fully autonomous and uses a number of functions. That's what people focus on these days. Some others may remember the past that autonomous vehicles did start in the agriculture. And what you see to the left, courtesy of John Deere, is an automated spraying machine. It is gigantic. And these are some of the first autonomous vehicles. And in our research at AVAIRX, we found that acceptance can start elsewhere than just thinking people transportation. Now, MaaS and AVs, a number of people were asking us, but it's a very uncommon mix. It's an uncommon mix in the sense that everybody has been focusing on autonomous vehicles for the past years, mainly because Google was discussing autonomous vehicles. They started with this. The DARPA challenge with the US Army was working on this. Uber, basically any vehicle manufacturer today has got an autonomous vehicle project. Then came MaaS. MaaS was not so much linked to OEMs, vehicle manufacturers. Some other mobility service providers started to work on it. So we've been working in these reports for years. We've looked at 4 world regions, and really what comes out is that you do have a varying national roadmaps when it comes to MaaS and autonomous vehicles. It goes beyond the problems of having geostrategic leaders, beyond the famous GAFAMs. Today, FANGAMs, you need to integrate Netflix as a GAFAM, and the BATXT is Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi, and TikTok. The Chinese platforms are working very hard and very strong on connections, autonomous vehicles, and anything that can promote mobility as a service. So we've looked at future developments and ways forward, and we do have some few questions for you. So we're going to be starting with the first poll, if it goes fine for you. You have some few minutes to answer this one. The first question to you is, what do you associate acceptance with? Plenty of questions. Is it adoptions for life, appropriation in everyday life, a step towards realization, stuff of dreams, a key element to success, the ability to simulate the real world, adaptation needs, coexistence between the past and the future? Let's get that running. We've got a few minutes, and take your time. All right, this is building up here. 40% of replying. Thank you. I mean, it's getting really interesting here. It's going to be interesting to, compare your first really impressions, insights with what we found in this report. 76, 80% have replied. All right, now the results. Number 1 is appropriation in everyday life. 55% of you are saying that it's really key, and then the others will share with you is a key element to success. Nobody's thinking is the stuff of dreams. That's quite interesting. Nothing around adaptation of needs. Okay, let's carry on then. Now, if we had to think acceptance and if we had to think autonomous vehicles, where should we be going for? Towards what? What would be the levers first to accelerate acceptance? As you can see there, we've got, it's a fairly famous pyramid. At the very bottom, you need infrastructure. It's got to be physical, it's got to be digital, as well as legal. Regulation, when we talk about autonomous vehicles, is really key. It is the same when you think of mobility as a service. We talk transportation, and transportation is regulated very differently from one country to the other, from one region to the other, from one sometimes village to another. Hardware is key. And when we think hardware, we're going to be thinking, of course, software as well, and solution providers. a solution provider would be a component, a sensor provider. And when we think MaaS, it's going to be a mobility service provider. We'll come back to that later on. Then there is the ODD and the maintenance. ODD is the operational domain design. Where is the autonomous vehicle going to be driving? Whereabouts? Where around? And as you can see, you've got a number of vehicles, what we call engines, that can be automated, and that could be also integrated in MaaS. And I mean, obviously, yes, you're going to say, yes, okay, a harvesting machine like the one that you've got here, no. No. A tractor, probably not. A dumper, probably not. But some others, yes. Many people are thinking, yes, these things should be integrated into MaaS. And that's something also we'd like, to find out more, and we could start running another poll here. Another question to you is, to realize an autonomous future, where, in your opinion, should autonomous technology be deployed initially? What about flying taxis? What about logistics within hubs? Logistics from hubs to inner cities? Single passenger transport outside the city? Multi-passenger transport in the city? Agriculture came out so far. What about mining? Waterborne, underwater systems? Medical, health, or life-saving systems? Wow, it's heating up, heating up. 76%, 80% of the participants are replying. 83% building up. Some more, please do take your time to answer. All right. The results, quite interesting. Many of you are thinking logistics within hubs. Second one, from what I see here, is multi-passenger transport in the city. Agriculture, yes, you do take that in mind. Mining, waterborne, underwater, 11 out of, a vast number of participants here. Flying taxis, not yet, although there is a lot going on regarding flying taxis and urban air mobility. Okay, let's carry on. Now, when we did the research and when we did the analysis, you do see this picture is very much like oriented, between cars, passengers, people cycling, using, yes, mobile phones, a bus. And so far, when we look at autonomous vehicles and all kinds of automation, apart from mining and agriculture, it's been showtime. There are plenty of levers and plenty of criteria that can help promote autonomous vehicles and automation. Some of them are linked to urban, suburban, rural use cases where people have been demonstrating how automated a bus could be functioning. You've all heard about problems that the Tokyo Olympics are facing, and we do know that they're going to come up also with some automation demonstrations. As much as London had electric vehicles, Tokyo will have autonomous vehicles. Paris is going to be working on demonstrating an autonomous vehicle kind of showcase, Los Angeles as well. These are linked to the famous field operational tests. You've got more than 1,000 field operational tests throughout the world. And the whole question was, what else? What can we expect that could be additional accelerators? What levers, what criteria could we think of when we think about autonomous vehicle acceptance? So if we had to put it all together, it's quite difficult in the sense that, as you all know, adoption of innovation, of emerging and unconventional systems, they start by understanding about the past. That's the then. We need to remember that there are things that are happening now, and we must build and think about the future. So if we would draw a metaphor with what we call here the tree of realization, at the very bottom you've got the roots. You've got a number of criteria, some of which, as we saw, can be connectivity, can be storytelling, a number of criteria and levers. At the very middle, you've got the trunk. That's the realization, actual adoption of a system. And then you do have the branches at the bottom of the tree. They are feeding the tree. And there are plenty of criteria and levers that we have identified. And as you can see, there are different ones. So, well, let's run the last poll here and let's find out what you think about what we need to have when it comes to realization. So in your opinion, what is the main challenge for autonomous vehicle adoption and acceptance? Thinking price, payment methods, security, interoperability, trust and privacy? What about awareness, availability of the service, accessibility, prediction, user experience, and also, I said it earlier on, reassuring storytelling. It's quite interesting how it's building up. I think we have a vast number of engineers joining the webinar when I see the results. I'm going to share them in a few seconds with everyone. There we go. Security comes first. It's very interesting. There's a number of things that came out in our research where, in fact, things are changing. Security is not granted yet, but security is taken as a must-have. It's sine qua non. Without security, we won't go anywhere. However, there are plenty of things that other domains have been working on, like awareness. In the mining industry, they've worked a lot about awareness. How do you make a miner aware that an autonomous vehicle can help them be safer? Prediction is not much discussed. That's something that we found also, and that, you know, there are plenty of projects where they think prediction of where and how autonomous vehicles will be rolled out is key. So, well, without any further ado, if we carry on, the whole point, and that's why you joined, is what about MaaS? We invited you to discuss how MaaS could be an accelerator for the acceptance and adoption of autonomous vehicles. As you can see here, we have an illustration and there is a magnifying glass where there are plenty of things that you already know about. You can see a bus, you can see cars, you can see people walking, you can see people waiting for a cab. There is a robot that is a delivery robot, shared bikes, cargo bikes, people reading, there's a railway. And then if you look a bit outside, of course, there's tramways and all these things. So without any further ado, I think we should start discussing with Mr. Cottet. Aurélien, then again, a very warm welcome to you. I will leave the floor to you, and if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself to start discussing MaaS, we'd be very happy to listen to you.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. So first, I would like to thank AVAIRX on Manuel Chaufrein for inviting me today to talk about my passion for the past 3 years and a half, MaaS. And previously, I had the chance also to work on the autonomous vehicle. I've been working at Transdev, so if everyone don't know what is Transdev is one of the biggest public transport operator around the world. We operate nearly everything that can be operated from buses, train, boats, even telepheric. And we are one of the first to work on autonomous vehicle nearly more than 10 years ago because we are already having an operation in Rotterdam, where from the airport to the business centers, you have a dedicated line run by autonomous vehicle, and it has been operated by Transdev for past 10 years. So my name is Aurélien Cottet. For past 3 years and a half, I've been the MaaS, Mobility as a Service expert for Transdev around the world. So let's start by the beginning. What MaaS? Because MaaS is a trendy word. We use MaaS for a lot of things, but at the end of the day, the definition should be simple. Mobility as a service is a concept, in fact, what was thought a long time ago by the tour operator providing services for tourism. That means they wanted to make sure that people who didn't order a trip somewhere in a country that they don't know anything about, without a guide, they could be they could move around without any problems. But it was in the 80s, so the idea was how we can help a tourist that is buying just a fly or a train ticket to go to another country, to help them, this person or the family, moving around. But the real MaaS, what we call MaaS right now, it came from because for past 10 years, we saw a lot of new innovation, mobility arriving in our cities. The first one that really disrupted everything was Uber. Thanks to the smartphone, with a simple application, you could link a demand on an offer, the demand of someone who wants to go from A to B. And the offer was a simple driver in a car receiving a demand and say, okay, I can pick you up. And then the demand on the offer was done. This digitalization revolutionized the way of a mobility will think. Because everything now is connected, we have bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, e-mopeds, car sharing, etc., etc. So the mobility for the past 10 years multiplied the number of silos. The public transport in one part, the Uber on another part with Lyft and etc., the TNCs, the taxis, the sharings, and the pooling. All those silos at one moment, because they are digitalized, we thought, why don't we put them under the same umbrella? So the MaaS is the integration of all the mobility services you may have in one territories within one channel. So the end user could go from, plan a trip from A to B, and then being able to choose the mode he or she wants. The fastest, the cheapest, only the vehicle that are mechanical or electrical, adding some feature like I want to make sure that I'm walking a certain distance in my day-to-day trip, etc., etc. The digitalization is the key that allow this kind of system. So the MaaS is the integration of all the mobility within one territory and enable a user to plan a trip and choose, being able to book and pay within this application. And it's important to say within the application because we see a lot of aggregators where you have all the mobility informations within one territories, but when you really want to buy something, you are redirected to the mobility service provider you want to use. And is not what we want, especially because the MaaS is probably the tool of the future for the city to enable them, allow them to enforce their mobility policy. And better, with all the mobility service, private and public, within one platform, all the data gathered there, it should allow any city and region to rethink and redesign the network of mobility, public and private. Where the autonomous vehicle is going to be plugged in it. So for me, autonomous vehicle is a dream when you just take your iPhone or your Android and you say I want to go from A to B, and you have a taxi that is picking you up from your place to wherever you want. Especially when you are living in a very complex city like New York, London, or Paris, all those big capitals. In reality, the autonomous vehicle will be there, but not like with a robotaxi straight away. I'm a strong believer that the first step of the autonomous vehicle will be the public transport with dedicated lines for autonomous shuttles, small shuttles or big shuttles. Small shuttles, why? It's because it's going to replace at one moment or another the possibility to have a shuttle 24/24, especially during the night, early morning, late evening, or even during the rush hours. Why? It's because when you think about it, the public transport is subsidized because it has a cost and it's very expensive. How to optimize the cost is to use the big buses during the rush hour and smaller buses that you could call advertisement during the off-peak or during the night. And because a driver is a cost, and it's a bigger cost during the night, early morning, there the autonomous vehicle could be an answer, where you will be able to order your autonomous vehicle, or you go to the station and because the station will be connected, will know that you are looking for an autonomous vehicle, and then this vehicle will come. And you will have also the right data to know when this autonomous vehicle will come. And this could be done in the next 5 years, 10 years. Why? It's because the technology is there now. At least when you have a very dedicated, secured line for such a vehicle. With the pandemic, we have an interesting reorganization of a city that was going on. A lot of people decided to stop using the public transport because they were afraid to be too close to people who maybe they may have the COVID. So it was a safety situation. So suddenly we started to have a lot of people buying bikes or mopeds on the street of many cities started to be reinvented. That means less car, dedicated lines for bikes on mopeds, on e-scooters. If you think about it, if a city can readdress his streets to this kind of light mobility, why not to block completely streets for autonomous vehicle? And then it's going to be very easy to rethink the center of the cities from a part of a city to another part, crossing the middle with dedicated lines with autonomous vehicle. And this could be done in the next 5-10 years. And for that, to make sure that this mobility as a service and the autonomous vehicle demands are matching the demand of the people between the physical cars, the bikes, etc., the MaaS will be the answer. So the MaaS will be the tool of a smart city that will be the commodity of a mobility. Imagine that in the next 10 years, you may be able to buy your ticket to get in the public pool and buy your mobility at the same time. And it could be autonomous too. So if you want, we can start to talk about answering your question you may have and to talk about MaaS and autonomous vehicle.
Yes, there was a first question. Is MaaS referring to passengers transportation mobility only, or it applies to cargo freight too?
So that's a very interesting thing, because at one moment or another, we need to think that people are moving like goods. And I know that Uber and Amazon are working right now on how to integrate the mobility of the people with the mobility of the package they order online. Why that? Because right now, people are more and more used to buy online. So the number of packages delivered per day are exploding for the past 2-3 years. 5 years ago, how many people were ordering on Amazon in France? Not that many. But right now, you have many people who are ordering on who didn't order before the pandemic. But because we were locked down, the reflex to go online and to buy things that we were supposed to buy on the shop not too far away was a reflex. So the number of package was multiplied. The problem with Amazon right now is how to make sure that the package is delivered the first time. That means you have the delivery people will go one time at your place to deliver one package. The problem is also, if you order too many times, you're going to be delivered many packages at different times. So the MaaS would be a very interesting tool for also delivery companies to know when the people will be on a delivery hub on the commute back from office to home to pick up the package, and then reducing the number of delivery drop off without anyone waiting for the package at home.
Thank you, Aurélien. Very interesting. I have some questions for you then, because when we did the research, there's a lot about payment. Everybody is currently focusing a lot on our rights. We need to find new business models to roll out autonomous vehicles. MaaS as such is a new value proposition, but what business model around it? We've seen SoftBank investing heavily on autonomous vehicles. Now they've disinvested. And MaaS, everybody's focusing on the engines, the vehicles, and all these things. What about, the payments? I mean, how are you going to pay for your autonomous ride? Are you going to be using, the Uber app for MaaS, and then you basically, you've got Uber Eats, you pay Uber Eats, and then it delivers a burger to you, but then at the same time, you can have an autonomous vehicles combined to it. How do you see it?
So it's very interesting because a lot of people ask me who are going to be the big winner in the MaaS industry. And I say the first winners will be the payment industry. Why? It's because at the end of the day, consuming mobility or anything is buying something. So if you don't pay, you don't consume. So the act of payment is very important. And what is very interesting, we are talking about different business model, B2C, business to customer, B2G, business to government, or B2B. And I like to say B2B to EE, business to employee employer. And I would come back to that because for me, MaaS won't work without the impulsion of the employer pushing the employee to be more sustainable in their daily commute. But to come back on the payments, 2 years ago, I was talking with some people with Google because I was very surprised that we didn't see much Google in the area of MaaS. We were seeing ear technology, ear mobility, Move It, city mappers, transit app. Uber is definitely working on it, but definitely not Google. And in fact, the guy told me, he said, we are working hard on the MaaS, but we lead it with Google Pay. And I was like very surprised. I said, why Google Pay? He said, but the map is just an enabler. It's just the interface. The act of payment is where we got the data to make sure that the person really consume the mobility. So for me, yes, the payment is going to be very important. And the interesting part of MaaS is normally you are supposed to consume everything in the application and have only one payment done within the application without any redirection. So the autonomous vehicle, if it's integrated with MaaS, would be exactly the same as when you order a taxi or if you want to unlock a bike or a car sharing. What is also very important is I'm a strong believer that MaaS needs to include the private car. Why? It's because if you look at the offer of all the mobility, they are very complementary within the city. But people who are using the private car are most of the time are living outside the city, in the suburb or distant suburb on the rural area. That's where the MaaS should be an asset for these people. And it's very important to include the car because I'm a strong believer in park and drive. We see on this picture that you have a hub of mobility. This hub of mobility could be definitely in the center of a city, but it could be also at the border outside the city to give an access to people who are living in the distant suburb. So for me, it's very also important to think that more and more the private car will be electrical. Why don't we can integrate also the recharge options linked into the MaaS, meaning you can book a place where you could recharge and everything will be paid thanks to the application. So yes, to answer your question, payment is one of the key to enable this conglomeration of all those mobility within one channel.
Thank you. I have some more questions before we go to the Q&A with everyone. That you mentioned one thing about like having a mobility hub like this one that we see here on the screen. Where do you think MaaS will really start? Should it be like suburban? Should it be in the rural areas? Should it be like in the hyper center of the cities? When we look at Finland, they're leading when it's like MaaS discussions. They've been looking at autonomous vehicles, but then their roadmaps do not align. What's your views on that?
I think there is a lot of trend around MaaS, but the reality is MaaS has two issues. The first issue is, as I was saying, mobility is a multiple of silos. The silos of a taxi silos of a public transport. And even within the public transport, you can have different operator in one city, like in UK, where you have small cities with 10 different bus operators. So you have different people who are not competing, but they are operating on their side without thinking that they could be complementary to another mobility services. So it's very difficult for those legacy mobility on newcomers to think that they can work together. And it's important also to think that MaaS is one channel for to access all the mobility. A lot of mobility service providers are reluctant to be integrated in a MaaS because they are afraid that they're going to lose the direct contact with the clients. And that's one of the main issues, is how to convince everyone that the win-win situation is if everyone works together. And that's where MaaS will have to be regulated strongly to impose some rules for the public transport and the private sectors to work together for the good of the citizen. To answer your other question is technical. People forget that data is very expensive. And for public transport that is subsidized, digitalizing your operation has a cost. Who is paying? So it's very important to understand that first, it's a question of contract and make sure that people can get together and understand that it's a win-win situation. And that's very difficult for everyone to understand. And the second is not everyone is technically ready to be integrated. So that's why we are still on test and learn in many places en masse.
Thank you, Aurélien. We've got some more questions going on. We have some 25 minutes less. I mean, the whole idea is to maximize exchanges and then, try to get you to answer all questions possible. We've got one here. If AVs such as shuttles are only likely to be accepted by people if they are on dedicated routes, do you think cities are ready to invest in this by dedicating or closing off-roads in the inner city?
I think it really depends on which cities. There are cities that do have the place to do this kind of things, because when I say dedicated lines, it's very easy. It's just a simple wall. So it's not something. The important there is to have a line. It doesn't matter if the stops are regular or not. You could have a line that is dedicated with an autonomous shuttle with a virtual stop and could stop exactly where the person is without any station. But the dedicated line is very important. Why? It's because if you want to have a fast track and to allow the mass to go from to go to one part of the city to another part of the city, you need a dedicated line, like a bus rapid transport. So yes, some city will be lenient to do that, some won't. It's just a political view on a political, I would say, strength to do things.
Talking investment as well, I mean, the crisis has had a huge impact, especially on public transport operators. Some of them have, seen 50% less ridership. Even, I mean, car hailing, ride pooling and all these things have gone down, physical distancing and, concerns, lockdowns and all these things. When you look at the first MaaS, looking at what they did in Finland, for instance, yes, you could have something like a 300 euros or a 500 euros, complete package on a monthly basis. What about now, taking into account the crisis and then people having less money? How can autonomous vehicles, provided they may be more affordable, be applied to MaaS?
That's a very good question, and that's why if you remember just a few minutes ago, 10 or 15 minutes ago, I was talking about it will be very important to integrate the employers in the solution. Employers did a tremendous job all around the world to make sure that the happiness of the employee within the office is done. So you have many companies who invested to make sure that the buildings are more welcoming and try to reset the mindset of people coming at the office to have an enjoyable life. More and more companies understand that the real life of an employee starts when the person is leaving her or his home. So the commute is very important. It's the first burden of an employee as an employer, as an employee life. So I think there the employer is going to start to invest in mobility budget, where they're going to help the employee to reduce the burdens by paying a part of the mobility. And for that, they're going to not imposed, but the mobility budget will be only used in certain mobility services, such as public transport, shared mobility, pooling, electrical solution, etc., etc. So the employer will be probably the answer in the economical system for MaaS and for the autonomous vehicle.
Thank you. We've got some more questions coming in. One last question on my side probably is, who do you think as a stakeholder can be the winner? I mean, public transport operators, they transport millions, if not like, billions of people throughout the world every day. They don't really have a good access to the end client, to the end rider. OEMs are fighting to keep the contact, as you said, with the end user. And then you've got the mobility service providers or like companies like Uber who know everything about us, even whether we prefer, McDonald's or Burger King. Who do you think could be, the upcoming winner when it's like applying MaaS and autonomous vehicles? And then we'll go to the Q&As.
I think, it depends where you're referring to. What I mean by this is in the big cities, you will have many MaaS providers, B2C, B2B, and B2G. In the medium cities, I could guarantee you that most of the MaaS would be B2G, business to government, and it will be the extension of a public transport. Why? It's because in medium cities, you will have one bike, one sharing bike company, one e-scooter sharing bike, e-scooter shared company. You will have no competition between the same silo. So the MaaS will be easier to implement. And to make sure that people will use the MaaS, it will be, we will create reward system, and it will be incentive by the government. And so for me, the big winner will be the technical providers in these medium cities. In big cities, it's different because we are talking about frequent traveler that are traveler from big city to big cities. And there you have a big business to do because you will handle the expenses of the mobility of the people traveling for business or for tourism. So here, a company like Google will have a huge asset to provide the mobility, but everything around. So the mobility will be an enabler for this company like Uber also to gather more information, to resell this information to third parties to sell other services. So outside the payment where it doesn't matter, they're going to be the big leader, the big winner. It really depends if you are talking about small cities, medium cities, or big cities.
Thank you. Nice Q&A time. We have some 20 minutes, so the idea is to open up the floor to all the attendants. We've got a question here who is like, how realistic is it to consider flying taxis as part of MaaS, considering their higher ticket price, when considering inclusion and affordability issues in the context of urban mobility? What are your views around these things? I mean, it's like two questions in one. Higher ticket price is one, like, question, of course, about flying taxis, and then inclusion. What do you think?
So inclusion is very important because that's why we think that the MaaS has, it's very important, it has to be managed and regulated by the state. Why? It's because moving is a right for people. You can be rich, poor, you can be in good health or on a wheelchair. It's your right to be able to go from A to B. So that's why also the public transport is subsidized, to make sure that some services we are losing money, on some services we are earning money, and at the end of the day we are making a small thin margin. But it's important that we have an obligation to answer all those demands. Flying taxis, it's exactly in the title, flying taxis. How many people are taking taxis? Not that many people. Most of the people are taking taxis are business people. Flying taxis is going to be the same. They're going to be there for purpose and for a part of a society, people who can afford it. Not everyone can afford a taxi, not every day. So for me, flying taxis is going to be part of the MaaS, and people who's going to use flying taxis are people who can afford it.
It's interesting because there's been like plenty of studies regarding, price points of, okay, if you've got a 15-minute, let's say, flight with a flying taxi, then you pay, I don't know, $100, $200. Uber has been like, having the Uber copter, and then they combined it. I mean, Uber now has sold its, let's say, flying elevate operations to Joby Aviation. So there are clearly, concerns where stakeholders do get an economy started and then they shift according to crisis. What do you think? I mean, if everybody's going to tell us we're going to have some more crisis, and what should we go first? I mean, should we think MaaS as being affordable, or should we think, focus on urban mobility that can be affordable, so that in fact people can, avoid congestion? I mean, it's getting more and more complex. What do you think?
I think for me, MaaS, as I was saying just a little bit before, it really depends on where you are. In big cities, it will be a huge help for people who are living from the distant suburb. And I give you, and that's why I was saying that I think it's very important for those MaaS to include the car on the parkings. I give you my personal life. I'm living not too far from Versailles. And when I go to Paris, I take my car and I park at the first train subway station, and then I take the public transport. So I'm the perfect example of the person who would love to have an application where I could order and book my and pay for my parking, so I can reserve it and pay for my metro ticket or my bus ticket at the same time within one application. So for me, yes, the MaaS will be first an answer to help people to find an alternative to their private car when it's possible. Then it's going to help also people to stop jungle between different applications. When I'm traveling in the US, I'm always between Lyft and Uber. Which one? I open both of them each time. It's not an answer. It would be better to have one application where I can see that, in fact, I could take the bus. So that's why in Denver, for instance, it was the first public transport operator that allowed Uber to integrate the public transport ticketing within Uber application. And I had an interesting conversation with the CEO of Denver public transport operator, who told me that, in fact, they started to have some people who they open the Uber application and realize that the Uber driver won't be there before 10 minutes. And in fact, suddenly the train is arriving in 2 minutes. And at the end of the day, it's going to take less time to take the train than waiting for Uber to come, get in the Uber, and get in the center of the city. So here you have this perfect example to see also that Uber is not necessarily the best option when you arrive at Denver airport to go to the center of the city.
All right, thank you. I think it's got a link also. We have another question here is, can we imagine that the integration of AV services into MaaS may be able cities to better regulate the use of vehicles? I imagine it's like all kinds of vehicles. For example, pushing best options regarding network management or environmental metrics. That's a complex one. This one is like, you've got regulation, AV services, MaaS, and how to help cities.
So it's important to think that we are in the test and learn, still on the test and learn in MaaS. On the European Commission, for instance, if we are talking about Europe, are start thinking to try to understand how to regulate it. What should be open and what not should be open in the data. And it's important that if all the data is open with all the mobility services, is how you can let the public transport authority locally to drive its mobility policy. And the mobility policy could be definitely to ask any MaaS, public or private, to show as a first option something that is more sustainable, mobility service that is more sustainable than something else. So it really depends on how each country or city will want such mobility policy to be implemented and enforced for the mobility within their city. And MaaS will be the perfect tool to do that.
Thank you. Linked to this, there's another question coming up, but it's like everybody's talking about low emission zones, carbon taxation. I mean, MaaS started with vehicles that had internal combustion engines, and these vehicles were sort of like polluting. Do you think, and how do you see it, that we could have a specific MaaS taxation according to the environmental impact these vehicles would have, whether that be AVs or any kind of vehicles? Like, thinking regulation and taxations, I think, is key as well.
Yes, and for my part, I'm a strong believer that in the next 10, 15, 20 years, the carbon emission calculation for each company will include the commute of the employees. Why I'm saying this is because if you think about the big consulting firm like Accenture or Capgemini, they do have hundreds of thousands of employees, but the carbon offset calculation is mainly on their buildings that they own, not on the mobility of all their employees that are working at their clients. So if you think about that, you have some small companies that do have more carbon emission than those big consulting firms. So yes, I think I want to know the commute of each employee will be included in the carbon emission of each companies. And there you will see the employers be pushing their employee to be more sustainable. So the regulation will also include these parts that we don't see, that is going to come, and hopefully for the good of everyone.
Thank you. We have now, because I know you've got another meeting afterwards, we've got 9 minutes left. Thank you for your time. One question here again is like, could digitalization of public space be used as a regulatory tool for cities to ensure societal beneficial development of AVs and MaaS? For instance, for parking or dedicated lines. Are cities interested in this topic?
So digitalization, it's yes, it's very important. We are talking about the smart city. Smart city, it means that everything is digitalized on each department of a city would be complementary to each other. When I was talking about you being able to use an application where you would be able to order your AV and pay for your pool at the same time to go to the swimming pool, that's definitely the fact that all those cities will be digitalized. So the public space needs to be digitalized, not only the mobility, but everything around. And yes, it needs to be regulated. And because everything is digitalized, it's going to be easier to control and to enforce. If you think about, if you are following what is going on in Los Angeles try to put in place a platform where each private operator, shared mobility operators like Lyft, on Uber, on bikes, on e-scooters, have to be integrated within this platform and share some data with the city of Los Angeles. So Los Angeles can have a better idea of where people are going at the real time and being able to manage the traffic lights. So to help to decongestion the flow of mobility of people real time. This can only be done if the city is digitalized. And to do so, it's a question of also budget, time, and solution. So I don't know if I really answered your question, Julia.
It's quite complex, yes. I mean, this one's quite complex. We've got 5 minutes left. Please, I mean, do go ahead if you've got some questions. I imagine some people are shy, some people have already some answers. The idea, again, is to be able to share as much as possible. We've covered plenty of things here. I mean, it's like from mining, agriculture, thinking smart territories. I have a question for you also, Aurélien. It's like there are new stakeholders coming in. If you look at China, you have a lot of building constructors, building managers who are thinking of integrating mobility services. What are your views around these things? What can be done?
It's funny. I'm working into a think tank about mass on real estate. Why is that? It's because in many countries, like for instance in the Netherlands right now, when you are building a new construction, on if you are doing renovation in some part of Netherlands, you have some restriction in terms of number of parking spots per apartment. In the 80s, when you were building a building with apartments, you had an obligation to have 1 to 2 parking spot per apartment. Now it's 1 parking spot per 2 apartments. That means one of the apartment won't have a parking spot. So there, the real estate companies are thinking, okay, how we can integrate shared private mobility link with the building that could be shared by the people, and the cost will be a monthly fee integrated with the building fees. So if you think about that, we are going to start to create private mobility hub, and if everything is going to be electrified, those mobility hub with parking spots could be also open to public for people who are not living in the building but could park there to recharge he or her car while taking public transport to go somewhere else, and could create private link to the public hub of mobility. And for me, it's very interesting because MaaS will be for me the grid of all those public big hub of mobility on private small mobilities, because it's going to be linked also with the electrical grid.
Thank you. We'll take one last question here. When you say that cars shall be included in the MaaS scheme, the person is saying, I agree. Does it mean that it would also be subsidized, or is it just about giving the possibility to take a car and pay for it within the MaaS?
If you include the private car, there are two ways to things. You have people who don't have any choice. So they take the car and they try to park, and then they can use the public transport. For those people, yes, it should be subsidized. For people who do decide to take their own car and do have an option to walk 5 minutes from their place, and don't get me wrong, 5 minutes could be very difficult for someone who is in a wheelchair or someone who has some problem to move. But if this person is in perfect healthy condition, could walk and take the public transport, and the difference between private car and alternative using public transport is less than 5% of the length of a trip, No, this private car shouldn't be subsidized, even if this person will park at one moment never.
Very interesting in the sense that there are different developments, from one region, country to the other, subsidized or not. I mean, we do understand that most of the governments now are on recovery plans. Everybody here in the community, I think, hope that mobility as a whole, including future developments, will be also supported. That's very interesting. Aurélien, thank you very much. I think we've got 2 minutes running. One last thing for those of you who would like to know more. Plenty of options for everybody to stay in touch and communicate. We do invite you. You've seen that also on the chat. You can answer a form, and we'll send you more information about the upcoming research that we're running with the community. You can contact us on the website. You can also reach us, throughout the contact@avairx.com. We have some more episodes that are coming. Some of them will be in French right next week. We'll take the subject again about acceptance, but trying to take it a bit further. Not discussing MaaS, but a bit more towards humans. How would humans react to these new emerging and non-conventional systems? Then again, the slides will be available on demand. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. The team is there. You find us on LinkedIn, or you do have the contact lines. Once again, thank you very much for everybody for attending. Aurélien, it's been fantastic. Thank you again very much for your time, very precious time. We understand, you're moving forward for some additional missions. Thank you very much again. Very warm greetings to everyone. Do stay safe. It's time to, remain safe as far as you can, as much as you can. And we look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a safe end of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again for inviting me. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.